First, it's the realisation of the very significant threat from their east, in other words, from Russia. All that's been happening in Ukraine, Russia invaded Ukraine well over 4 years ago, and I think the Baltic states, Estonia included, very much feel that they're next in line for Russians' expansionist ideas. And Putin has said this many, many times, maybe not directly, but he wants to recover the old Soviet bloc, the old Soviet states, and Estonia is very much one of those. I think it's also an acknowledgement of how seriously they rate the threat. Now, they, of course, are right next to Russia. They have a vast border with Russia. And I think it shouldn't be a wake-up call, but it is a bit of a wake-up call for us here in the UK that Estonia are investing so heavily in their defence now, and it's not just their defence; it's the whole country, because the blockade and everything in it also talks about national resilience. People having to make sure that they've got at least 7 days of food and water in their possessions, know what to do. So it's a comprehensive approach to what Estonia sees as really the most important thing to them, which is why it's not just about rearming and spending more money, but it's a whole ethos of how they're going to fight. And a lot of this blockade is about the sort of blocking bit is perhaps what people have become very familiar with, these vast defensive lines along their border with Russia, 30, 40 miles deep of trenches and mines and barbed wire and all that sort of stuff. But this process is also about how they would fight. And very much it's about getting on the front foot and attacking deep into Russia, which again is a real change when you're in a defensive mindset. In a way, that's sort of counterintuitive. But I think what they're learning from the Ukrainians is actually the best way to halt the Russian war machine is to attack it in depth behind it, so that its logistics crumble. And I suppose the final bit I'd say on this introduction here, we had the Strategic Defence Review in the UK last year, which was looking about how we would fight in the modern environment and going forward. And this is very much what the Estonians have done. However, they have put a lot of money behind it. So, at the moment, the SDR is just a piece of paper. Until it's funded, it doesn't really mean a great deal. But the Estonians have come up with their doctrine, if you like, how they're going to fight from what they've seen in Ukraine. And now they're putting money behind it to make sure that they can actually achieve what they're suggesting with this blockade type strategy. I think all the Baltic states believe that they are being lined up next. Now, Estonia has a very large border with Russia, so it would be relatively straightforward for Russia to swing north, as it were, and then west. And I think also because Estonia is the gateway to the Baltic, which is vital ground for Russia. Russia knows that if it can control the Baltic, then it can control its lines of communication. So, yeah, it is a fair judge that Estonia would very much be in the sort of the crosshairs of Putin's next moves. And what we've seen with Ukraine, and what we perhaps failed with Ukraine, is to provide a significant conventional deterrence that Putin wouldn't try and attack it. And I think this is exactly what Estonia is trying to do, is this conventional deterrence, really saying, Russia, don't bother to attack us because you ain't getting anywhere. Don't waste your time. So it's a smart move. They are so very close to the problem, and it's something that the rest of us should note very seriously. I expect the Russians, I would have thought that would give them an awful lot to think about. There is no way, unlike the way they rolled into Ukraine, because there wasn't really much of a defensive blockade to stop it. They certainly can't do that now to Estonia. And we know how stretched the Russian army is anyway. They've lost over 1.5 million casualties. They're hardly in a position to do any sort of sophisticated ground maneuver, as we would call it. And, with Estonia providing such a hard block, that is really, I expect, changing the dynamics and thought processes in the Kremlin, and perhaps Putin as well. And I think it's, when we look at NATO and Europe, it's a really good message to show. If Putin thought that there was any lack of resolve in Europe, now we've got all the noise coming out of President Trump and the US at the moment about pulling out of NATO and not getting involved. That's been a real positive for Putin, whereas he now sees that NATO countries in Europe, like Estonia, spending a lot on defence, building up their defensive posture and recognising how you need to fight in the contemporary and future environment, which Estonia is absolutely showing. And Estonia very clearly saying, and by the way, we're going to attack you deep in Russia as well. And that has really hurt Russia. I mean, the Russian oil industry has been devastated by the Ukrainians. If they had the Estonians doing that as well, then that could really, really unhinge Russia. So I think from a European NATO perspective, this is really good, and a lot of other countries are sort of going the same way. I think when it comes to the posture and the way they want to fight with the use of air defence and drones is an interesting piece. I think there's a bit of risk here as well. They're saying they're not going to buy new tanks and armoured vehicles. They don't see them fighting a ground manoeuvre warfare as such, but that's predicated on the fact that they don't let the Russians in the first place. Now, what they do seem to be focusing on is CV90, which is a sort of light tank, if you like, for what in the UK we call recce strike, which is, again, all the lessons coming out of Ukraine. And in the UK, we're investing heavily in a vehicle called Ajax, which has had its challenges, but actually Ajax, like CV90, are recce strike vehicles. So again, I suppose focusing on that rather than more heavy armour. But it is a risk. You are assuming that you're not going to get Russian tank battalions steaming around Estonia, which, if their blockade works, that's not going to happen. But it is a bit of a risk, which let's hope that they've done all the sort of detailed study and analysis when they've decided to go down that route. Estonia is talking about preemption, and that is a very interesting piece. In other words, it is happy to attack Russia before Russia attacks it. So again, I think this is a very clear message to the Kremlin and to Moscow that if you start moving forces towards us, we're going to attack them long before they get to our border. And I think as a signal of intent, that is really good. And it's perhaps things that have been lacking over the last 4 years. Also in the fight with Ukraine is that Europe hasn't been preemptive. We haven't said that we're going to attack Russia before it attacks us. And that to me is a really clear marker in the sand. It is exactly as it should do. And if all the other European NATO countries follow Estonia's stance, I think European NATO countries collectively will be a much better and a much stronger position. And if we speak with one voice, you cannot imagine that Putin would test that. So if we are to assume that we can't rely on the Americans any longer, but if we copy what Estonia's done, then actually we'll go a long way to actually negating the loss of the American defensive pact and support to NATO in Europe. The other bit to this, which is related but not directly, is of course the ousting of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who was always seen as a pro-Russian supporter, and Hungary creating a sort of, a soft underbelly of Europe where potentially the Russians could exploit it. Now, with a new leadership in Hungary that is anti-Russian and pro-Europe, that really strengthened things up. So I think European countries are going in the right direction. There's a lot of good talk about spending more money, and people like Estonia are actually doing what they say they're going to do. And that should encourage others to do the same. So, we are in a much, much stronger position now than we were on the 24th of February 2022. When Putin looked west, he saw no conventional deterrence to stop him invading Ukraine. It's a very different situation now. And let us hope that it's a catalyst for the rest of Europe to follow suit, and also the catalyst for Putin to realise that he's gone as far as he's going to go, and he will, now start negotiating for a ceasefire and a just peace deal for Ukraine.